There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a dying town, not the peaceful quiet of open fields or the hush of early morning before the roosters go, but something heavier, something with weight to it. The kind of silence that fills up the spaces where noise used to live. The schoolyard, the feed store, the diner on Route 9 where Mabel used to keep the coffee hot from 5 in the morning until the last farmer came in smelling of hay and honest work. I've lived through a few kinds of silence in my years. I've sat beside dying men in the dust of summer and said nothing because nothing was the right thing to say. I've stood at the edge of a canyon in January and listened to wind move through rock like it was grieving something older than any of us. But the silence that settled over Grady Creek, Texas, in the spring of 2009, that one I wasn't prepared for. And I wasn't prepared for Elias Cutter either. Nobody was. He pulled up to the Harmon auction yard in a rusted 1987 Ford flatbed with bad shocks and a crack in the windshield that ran from corner to corner like a river on a map. He had $15 in his shirt pocket, a name that most people in the county had either forgotten or never learned, and absolutely no business buying 300 chickens that couldn't lay a consistent egg among them. But here's the thing about desperate men and unwanted creatures. Sometimes the universe puts them together for a reason nobody can explain until long after the fact. I know because I was there. I watched it happen, the whole strange, painful, improbable thing, and I'm still not entirely sure I understand it. But I'm going to try to tell it right. Because some stories deserve to be told right. I keep a log. I've kept one since I was 19 years old and working my first season as a ranch hand for the Delaney spread outside of Midland. Old man Delaney caught me writing in a little composition notebook one evening while the other hands were playing cards, and instead of making fun of me the way I expected, he just nodded and said, "Good habit. A man who doesn't write down what he sees ends up forgetting what he lived." I've held on to that. So most of what I'm going to tell you, I can tell you with some degree of accuracy because it's in the log. The dates, the conversations, the small details that most people wave away as unimportant. In my experience, the unimportant details are always the ones that matter most. I was at the Harmon yard because Dale Harmon owed me 2 days of fencing work from the previous fall, and he was paying me in kind. I'd take a look at whatever he had in the pens that morning and call it even at a fair price. Dale wasn't a bad man, just perpetually disorganized and slightly desperate, which in the livestock auction business is almost a job requirement. He had a habit of buying things in bulk that he couldn't quite move, surplus animals, off-breed cattle, roosters that crowed too much and hens that laid too little, and then looking pained and puzzled when nobody wanted them. The 300 hens were a case in point. He'd gotten them from a commercial operation 2 counties over that had gone under, a mid-sized egg producer named Garfield Poultry that had expanded too fast during the boom years, and then collapsed when the feed prices spiked, and their primary grocery contract evaporated. The hens weren't sick, exactly. They were what the industry calls stressed layers, birds that had been living in overcrowded conditions, under artificial lighting 22 hours a day, on feed laced with enough additives to make the eggs technically edible but barely anything else. Their production rates were unreliable. Their feathers were rough. Their dispositions, if chickens can be said to have dispositions, were somewhere between anxious and defeated. Dale had bought them because the price was right, and because he'd thought, incorrectly, that he could move them quickly to local small farm operators who might rehabilitate them. He'd been wrong. This was March, and he'd had them since November, which meant he'd been feeding 300 stressed, underperforming hens for 4 months out of his own pocket. "Take 'em," he said to me that morning, with the slightly frantic energy of a man who has been losing sleep. "I'll call us even on the fence work, and I'll throw in 2 bags of scratch grain." I looked at the pens. The hens were crammed together in a way that made me uncomfortable, not cruelly crammed. Dale wasn't a cruel man, but crowded. The noise they made wasn't the regular, conversational clucking of healthy chickens. It was something more agitated, a constant undercurrent of anxious sound, like an auditorium full of people waiting for bad news. "Dale," I said carefully, "I've got 47 acres and 11 of them are underwater right now from the February flooding. Where am I going to put 300 hens?" "I don't know," he said, "but I need them gone." That was when the Ford flatbed pulled in. I heard it before I saw it, the particular rattle of a suspension system that had given everything it had and then some, the low complaint of an engine that was running on will rather than mechanical soundness. It came through the gate at about 8 miles an hour, which was probably appropriate, and parked alongside the far pen in a cloud of pale dust. The man who climbed out was somewhere between 40 and 60, the kind of age that's hard to pin down on someone who has spent serious time outdoors. He was lean in the way that suggests not thinness but efficiency, no wasted material anywhere, just a frame designed for sustained work. He had a face that had been weathered past the point of handsomeness into something more useful, a face you trusted on instinct, the way you trust a well-worn tool. Brown eyes that moved slowly and took in everything. Hands that hung at his sides with a particular looseness that I'd come to associate with men who'd done a lot of physical labor. Hands that had learned to rest completely when there was nothing to do, because they knew hard work was always coming. He was wearing a canvas work shirt, faded jeans, and boots that had been resoled at least twice. There was a small notebook in his breast pocket. When I saw that, I almost said something, but I didn't. He walked to the pen where the hens were, and he stood there for a good 2 minutes without saying anything, just watching them. Dale appeared at my elbow, hopeful in the specific way of a man who sees a potential buyer and is trying not to spook him. "Help you?" Dale called out. The man turned. "These the Garfield birds." "They are." "How many?" 304. Lost a couple in November." The man nodded slowly. He looked back at the hens. Then he reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and opened it with the careful precision of someone who knows exactly what's inside and is accounting for all of it. He extracted 3 $5 bills and held them out. $15 for the lot," he said, "and I'll load them myself." Dale blinked, I blinked. The hens made their anxious noise. $15, Dale repeated. "That's what I've got." There was a long pause. I watched Dale perform the internal mathematics of a man who has been carrying a loss for 4 months and is weighing a tiny recovery against continuing to carry it further. "Deal," Dale said. I wrote that down later when I got home. March 14, 2009. Elias Cutter bought 304 distressed hens for $15 at Harmon Yard. Don't know who he is. Don't know what he's planning. Something about the way he looked at those birds. I didn't know then what I was looking at. I figured it out later, slowly, the way you figure out the shape of something that's too close to see whole. His name was Elias James Cutter, and he had been born in Grady Creek 53 years earlier in the same farmhouse where he was now living alone. His father had been a small-scale chicken and hog farmer, his grandfather before that. The Cutter land, 12 acres on the north edge of town, hard against a dry creek bed that only ran in good years, had been in the family since 1889, when his great-great-grandfather had staked a claim and built something from nothing in the particular stubborn way of people who had no other option. I learned most of this not from Elias himself, because Elias was not a talkative man in any conventional sense, but from Vera Hutchins, who ran the post office and knew everything about everyone in Grady Creek, the way post office workers often do, by virtue of seeing every piece of mail and every face that came through the door. "Elias Cutter," Vera said, when I mentioned his name a few days after the auction. She was sorting parcels with the fluid efficiency of someone who had been doing the same task for 30 years and had achieved a kind of unconscious mastery. "Lord, I haven't heard that name much lately. He doesn't come into town very often. What do you know about him?" She paused in her sorting, which meant she was deciding how much to tell me, which meant there was more to tell. "His wife passed 4 years ago now. Dina Cutter, she was a Morales before they married. Lovely woman, cancer." She resumed sorting. "After that, Elias kind of withdrew. He'd always been a quiet man, but he got quieter. Folks say he stopped farming seriously around then, just maintaining." "What kind of farm?" "Chickens, mostly. His daddy kept chickens, his granddaddy too. I think Elias had maybe 40, 50 hens at one point. Local eggs, sold to a few restaurants in town before the restaurants started closing." She paused again. "Most of the businesses downtown are gone now. You know how it is." I did know how it was. The shutdown of the Grady Creek manufacturing plant, a small metals operation that had employed about 180 people, 3 years earlier had accelerated what had already been a slow decline. Young people left. Older people stayed because they had nowhere to go and nothing portable to take. The town's tax base had cratered. The school was down to 112 students across 12 grades. The diner where Mabel used to keep the coffee hot had closed 18 months ago. What I didn't know yet was why Elias Cutter had spent his last $15 on 300 chickens nobody wanted, and what he intended to do with them. I went out to his place on March 21st. I told myself I was in the neighborhood. My own land abutted the North County road that ran past his turnoff, but that was partially true at best. The real reason was that I'd been thinking about those hens for a week, and I'd been thinking about the way Elias Cutter had stood at the pen and watched them. There had been something in that posture that I recognized but couldn't name, something I wanted to understand. His driveway was unpaved, a quarter-mile of pale caliche that wound between scrubby cedar and the occasional live oak. At the end of it, the farmhouse appeared, a modest clapboard structure, white paint gone to a dignified gray, with a deep front porch and a tin roof that had probably been there since the 40s. Behind the house, several outbuildings in varying states of repair. And beyond those, a series of wire enclosures that hadn't been there before, or rather, had been there before but not in this configuration, not this size. He'd been busy. The enclosures covered what I estimated to be about 2 full acres of ground, not a small thing for 12-acre property. The wire was a mix of old and new, some of it clearly salvaged, some of it fresh hardware cloth. Inside, the 300 hens moved in a way that was already, 1 week later, different from the way they'd moved at Harmon's, more dispersed, less frantic. The sound they made was still anxious in places, but there were patches of ordinary chicken noise in it, the comfortable, low-stakes clucking of birds who have found a patch of interesting ground. Elias was at the far end of the enclosure, crouched down, watching a small cluster of hens with an intensity that seemed disproportionate until I realized he wasn't just watching. He was counting, assessing, making decisions. "Mr. Cutter," I called from the fence line. He looked up, looked at me for a moment, not suspiciously, but with the careful gaze of a man who processes new information thoroughly before responding. Then he stood, brushed the dust from his knees, and came over. "I know you," he said. "You've got the Hollowell land up the road." "I do." "Cole Whitaker," I extended my hand. He shook it. His grip was the grip of a man who works with his hands, firm but not performing firmness, just the natural result of doing real things. "What can I do for you?" "Nothing, really. I was at Dale Harmon's when you bought these birds. I've been curious about what you were planning." He looked at the hens for a moment. There was something in his face that was hard to read, not closed off exactly, but careful. Like someone who has learned to think before speaking, because speaking has sometimes gotten them into trouble. "Rehabilitation," he said finally. "For the hens. For the hens and maybe for something else." He glanced at me sideways. "You want coffee, it's not fancy." It wasn't. It was black and slightly overbrewed, and served in a mug that had a chip out of the handle. But I sat at his kitchen table, and I drank it, and what I heard over the next hour changed the way I thought about a lot of things. He'd had a plan before he walked into Harmon's yard. That surprised me, because the $15 bid and the rusted truck and the general economy of his appearance had suggested something more improvised. But he'd been thinking about this for several months, since the previous fall, when the last restaurant in Grady Creek had closed, and he'd driven past the shuttered storefront and sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long time. "The town's not dead," he said, "but it's going to be if something doesn't change." He wasn't saying this dramatically. It was more like a diagnosis. What Grady Creek had before, the plant, the businesses, that's not coming back. I've accepted that. But there are still 400 people living here, and most of them are elderly, and most of them are on fixed incomes, and the nearest grocery store is 31 miles away. I knew this. The grocery store had closed 2 years earlier, replaced eventually by a single gas station mini-mart that sold processed food at convenience store prices to people who couldn't afford to drive to the next town every week. "The school's nutrition program is barely functional," he continued. "I talked to the principal, Greta Sanchez, last fall. They're serving lunch from USDA commodity boxes, canned everything, minimal fresh protein. The kids are getting what they need to survive, more or less, but not what they need to develop. Dina," he stopped, set his mug down. "Dina was a dietitian before she got sick. She used to talk about what inadequate nutrition does to children at developmental stages, how you can see it in attention spans, in energy levels, in long-term health outcomes." He picked the mug up again, kept going. I figured if I could get a flock large enough to produce meaningful egg volume, real eggs, fresh eggs, from birds that are actually healthy, I could supply the school lunch program for free or at cost, and maybe the elderly residents who can't get to the grocery store, and maybe eventually turn it into something sustainable. I looked at him. He looked back at me with the patient, slightly wary expression of a man who has explained something he believes in to people who found it impractical, and has gotten used to that. 300 hens, I said, should get me to about 220, 230 good layers once they rehabilitate. That's roughly 160 dozen eggs a week at peak. The school needs about 40 dozen a week. The rest goes to residents at cost or in exchange for labor. No one pays more than they can afford. And the cost to you? He shrugged. Feed is the main thing, labor is me, I've got time. A pause. I've got a lot of time. I wrote in my log that evening, Elias Cutter is not a desperate man doing something random. He's a grieving man doing something deliberate. There's a difference, and I missed it at first. The rehabilitation of the hens was not a quick process, and it was not a simple one, and Elias did not make it look easy because it wasn't. Over the following weeks, I found reasons to stop by, sometimes with a specific errand, sometimes without one, and he gradually stopped looking faintly surprised to see me and started just handing me a coffee. I watched what he did with those birds, and I learned things about chickens that I'd never expected to know. The first issue was behavioral. Hens raised in commercial conditions develop a range of stress responses that make them difficult to manage in free-range situations. They don't know how to forage. They're aggressive with each other over resources they no longer need to fight over. They're hyper-responsive to stimuli. He spent the first 2 weeks doing almost nothing except letting them adjust, expanding the enclosure incrementally, providing consistent feed at consistent times so they learned there was no scarcity. Sitting in the enclosure himself, sometimes for hours, so they got used to a human presence that wasn't threatening. They have to relearn being chickens, he said once, watching a small group discover that the soil near the fence line was worth scratching at. There was something in his voice when he said it that I didn't want to examine too closely. The second issue was physical. About 60 of the hens showed signs of respiratory stress, feather loss beyond normal molting, or foot problems from life on wire flooring. He dealt with these one at a time, systematically. He'd learned animal medicine the way rural farmers often learn it, through necessity and observation, and the particular kind of knowledge that gets passed down through generations of people who can't afford a veterinarian for every problem. He lost 19 hens in the first month. I saw him bury 3 of them, which was more than most people would have bothered to do. He did it without ceremony, but also without rushing. Like the burial was a thing that deserved its appropriate duration. The third issue was money. He didn't have much of it, and feed for 300-plus birds consumed what little he had within 6 weeks. I know this because he told me, and because I could see it. The way he started cutting slightly on his own groceries, the way the coffee got thinner, the way he started sourcing damaged feed bags from the co-op at a discount, the ones with small tears or moisture damage that he'd check carefully before using. I offered to help with the feed costs. He said no. He said it politely, but in a way that was also clearly final. I'll ask if I need to, he said. I'll ask you first. He didn't ask for 3 more months, by which time everything had gotten considerably worse and considerably more complicated, and the whole situation had shifted in ways neither of us had anticipated. The letter from the county came in early May. Grady Creek School District, which had been on probationary status with the state for 2 years due to declining enrollment and financial difficulties, was being recommended for dissolution. Consolidation with the Marfield District, 35 miles away, pending a formal hearing in late June. Greta Sanchez, the principal, called an emergency community meeting. I went partly because I wanted to see how the town responded, and partly because I'd been thinking about Elias and his egg operation, and the way those 2 things, the school and the chickens, were connected in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The meeting was held in the school gymnasium on a Tuesday evening in early May. About 90 people showed up, which was about a quarter of the remaining population, and probably most of the adults who had children in the school or grandchildren, or who remembered what it had meant to have a school in town. There was anger in the room, but it was the particular kind of anger that lives next to despair, loud in places but hollow underneath, because people sensed that the anger wasn't going to change the fundamental mathematics. A school with 112 students, a collapsing tax base, and buildings that needed repairs the district couldn't fund was, from the state's administrative perspective, an inefficiency. Elias was there, sitting near the back. He had his notebook out. He was writing in it, which made me notice it properly for the first time, a small hardcover notebook, dark blue, the same size as the one in his shirt pocket at the auction. I wondered how many of them he'd filled. Greta Sanchez, who was a composed and capable woman under enormous pressure, laid out the situation without sugarcoating it. If the district was dissolved, the children would be bused. The trip each way was 35 miles on a county road that was in poor shape. For elderly residents with grandchildren, it would mean losing the social anchor that the school represented. For families with young children, it might be the deciding factor that pushed them to leave entirely. Which means, she said carefully, that we lose more families, which means enrollment drops further, which means the dissolution becomes self-fulfilling even if we fight it. A man in the third row, Gerald Pratt, who ran the last working gas station, said what a lot of people were thinking. So what are we supposed to do about it? We can't manufacture tax revenue. No, Greta said, but we can demonstrate community viability. The state's review process includes an assessment of whether the community has the capacity to support the school through non-traditional means. Partnerships, in-kind contributions, documented community investment. There was a long silence. Elias raised his hand. He wasn't someone who raised his hand at public meetings. I could tell from the slightly surprised looks from the people near him, who knew him at least by sight. He stood up when Greta nodded at him, and he spoke in the same quiet, careful way he spoke about everything. I've got 217 laying hens, he said. Right now they're producing about 98 dozen eggs a week. In 6 weeks, maybe 8, that number should be closer to 150 dozen. I've been in conversation with the school about supplying the lunch program. I want to formalize that. Put it in writing as a community contribution to the school's operational budget, the equivalent of what they'd pay for commodity protein at commercial rates. Whatever that number is, I'll commit to it. People looked at him. Some of them recognized him, I could tell. Some of them were meeting Elias Cutter for what was functionally the first time. That's generous, Elias, Greta said carefully, but the dollar amount the state would need to see. I know, he said. It won't be enough on its own. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying it's a start. He paused. And I'm wondering if anyone else has a start they'd be willing to put on the table. That was the moment. I felt it happen in the room, not a dramatic shift, not a sudden surge of energy, but something quieter. A slight change in posture here, a glance exchanged there. The specific recalibration of people who have been thinking in terms of despair and have been offered, maybe, a different frame. I wrote in my log that night, he's not just raising chickens. I see it now. He's using the chickens to raise something else. I'm not sure yet whether it's going to work. I went home that night, and I sat on my porch for a long time in the dark. My property had been in the Hollowell family, my mother's people, since the 30s, and I'd inherited it from my uncle 15 years ago when he died without children. I farmed it at a modest scale, enough to keep it going, and I had a pension from 22 years of working in agricultural extension that covered most of my actual expenses. I was not a rich man, but I was, compared to Elias Cutter, comfortable. I thought about Dina Cutter, who had been a dietitian and who had apparently talked to her husband about childhood nutrition with enough specificity that he could quote her concerns 4 years after her death. I thought about the specific kind of grief that makes a man go quiet for years, and then suddenly, improbably, spend his last $15 on 300 unwanted chickens. I thought about my log, and about old man Delaney's advice, and about the fact that what I was watching in Grady Creek that spring was something worth writing down carefully, because it was real and it was human, and it was the kind of thing that tends to get simplified in the retelling. Then I went inside, and I called Dale Harmon. Dale, I said, what's that fencing material worth that you've got stacked behind the east barn? A pause, why? Because I think Elias Cutter might need it. Another pause, then, Cole, I've been feeling bad about those hens. I sold them for basically nothing, and he ended up doing the work of rehabilitating them, and I just, I'll drop it off myself. That was the first of many small things that I watched people in Grady Creek do quietly, without announcement, in the weeks that followed. Not because anyone organized it. Because Elias had stood up at a meeting and said, "Here is my start," and something in that specific, practical, undramatic gesture had moved people who had stopped believing that gestures could matter. The log entry for May 14, 2009 is 3 pages long. It's mostly a list. I've looked at it since many times, and I'm still surprised by how many names are on it. The summer got hard before it got better. I want to be clear about that, because there's a version of this story that wants to slide from Elias' speech at the gymnasium meeting straight into some kind of warm-toned community revival. All amber light and people working together, and the natural goodness of small-town America vindicating itself through egg production. That version exists, probably. People have told it. But it's not accurate, and it doesn't honor what those months actually cost. June was brutal, not metaphorically, literally. The temperature in central Texas climbed to 104 on 3 consecutive days in the second week of the month, and it didn't break below 95 for 6 days after that. I've lived through Texas summers my entire life, and I remember that stretch. You go outside at 7 in the morning and the air already has weight to it, a physical thickness, and by noon the ground is radiating heat upward in visible waves, and any exposed metal surface will raise a blister. For 300 chickens in outdoor enclosures, it was a crisis. Elias had been prepared for heat. He'd built shade structures. He'd arranged additional water stations. He'd been monitoring the daily temperature and adjusting the birds' feed schedule accordingly. What he hadn't fully prepared for, because you can't fully prepare for something that hasn't happened before, was a heat event of this duration combined with an equipment failure. The well pump failed on June 11th. I know the exact date because I wrote it down, and I also know it because it's the date I showed up unannounced at 8 in the morning and found Elias hauling water by hand from a 200-gallon stock tank with a 5-gallon bucket. He'd been doing it since 4 a.m., when he'd realized the pump wasn't cycling. He'd already made the trip, 140 yards, each way 26 times. He didn't look up when I walked toward him. He was focused on not spilling. "Pump's out," he said, as if I couldn't see this. "I can see that. It'll take 2 or 3 days to get a replacement part from San Antonio. I've talked to the supplier." He set the bucket down at a water station and watched 2 hens drink immediately. His face was wet. His shirt was soaked through. "I can keep up with hand delivery if I stay at it." "Elias, you can't haul water for 300 birds for 2 days straight by yourself." "I'll manage it." There was that word, manage. I'd been hearing it from him in various forms since March. I'll manage the rehab, I'll manage the cost, I'll manage the math of it, and he'd been right mostly. He had managed things. But there's a specific kind of stubbornness that crosses the line from resilience into self-punishment, and I'd been watching for it, and I thought I was beginning to see it. "Your wife would tell you to ask for help," I said. It was a risk. I knew it was a risk before I said it. But I'd been thinking about Dina Cutter more than I'd expected to, the woman I'd never met, the dietitian who had told her husband about children's nutrition, and whose shadow I'd been watching move through everything Elias did. And I thought it was possible that invoking her was the only argument that might actually land. He stopped walking. He stood in the heat with an empty 5-gallon bucket in each hand, and he was quiet for a long moment. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was working through something. "You don't know that," he said. "No," I agreed, "but I'd bet on it." He looked at the enclosures. The hens were doing what chickens do in extreme heat, standing still, mouths open, panting. It's called panting in chickens, technically gaping, and it's how they regulate body temperature, but it's also a visible indicator of stress, and if it goes on long enough in high temperatures, it leads to heat exhaustion and death. "All right," he said, "but I'm asking people myself, not you." He walked to his truck, drove to town. Came back an hour and 20 minutes later with Gerald Pratt from the gas station, and a man named Tomas Vargas who had a small plumbing operation, and who looked at the pump for 10 minutes before announcing that he could fabricate a replacement part from components he had in his workshop, and have it operational by that evening. "How much?" Elias said. "We'll talk about it later," Tomas said. I suspect they did talk about it later, and I suspect the number Tomas named was substantially less than his cost, because that was the kind of man Tomas Vargas was, but I don't know for certain and I didn't ask. Gerald and I hauled water for the rest of that morning. And by the time we went home for lunch, the hens were drinking normally, and the immediate crisis had passed. Tomas had the pump running by 7 that evening. Elias called me that night. I was surprised he rarely called. "I owe you," he said. "You don't." "I do. I'll figure out a way to pay it back." "Elias," I said, "did you notice that Gerald didn't charge you for his time and Tomas is going to undercharge you for the repair?" A pause. "Yes. That's people paying you back for something you did by standing up at that meeting and saying, 'Here is my start.' You unlocked something. The water hauling is it's just the same thing going the other direction." He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might have hung up. Then he said, "I don't think of it that way." "I know you don't. That's what makes it work." The pump repair held, the heat broke. The hens, most of them, came through. He lost 9 more during that June heat event, birds that had been too compromised from their commercial operation histories to withstand the additional stress. He buried them the way he buried all of them, carefully, without ceremony but without dismissal. I watched him do it once from a distance, and I noticed that he stood at the small trench for a moment after he'd filled it in. Not praying exactly, I don't know enough about his beliefs to say that, just marking it. Acknowledging that something had lived and now didn't. I thought about that for a long time afterward, the way he treated the losses. It told me something about how he'd handled Dina's death. I thought not by refusing to acknowledge it, not by throwing himself into frantic activity to outrun it, but by sitting with it, marking it, and then doing the next necessary thing. There's a particular kind of grief management that only people with genuine emotional resilience can sustain, the kind that doesn't look like strength from the outside because it doesn't perform toughness or optimism. It just keeps going. He kept going. By early July, the flock had stabilized at 281 hens. The laying rate had improved substantially. The birds were foraging, dust bathing, establishing their own social hierarchies without the constant scarcity-driven aggression of their commercial conditions. The eggs were different from commercial eggs. Anyone who has eaten an egg from a genuinely healthy, free-ranging hen knows the difference. The yolk is darker, more orange than yellow, and the flavor has a richness that doesn't survive industrial production. These were those eggs. The school had recessed for summer, but Greta Sanchez had formalized the agreement in writing. Elias would supply 42 dozen eggs per week during the school year, valued at current commercial rates as an in-kind community contribution. It was a small number in isolation, but Greta had spent the intervening months assembling a portfolio of similar contributions from various community members and businesses, and the cumulative effect was starting to look like something that could be presented to the state's review board as evidence of community viability. There were other things happening that I was tracking in the log. The meeting in May had generated a kind of low-level organizing energy that I hadn't seen in Grady Creek for years. Partly it was pragmatic. People understood the stakes, understood that the school dissolution would likely be the thing that finally pushed the town past the point of no return. But it was also something less rational, harder to name. Something about the fact that a man with $15 and a rusted truck had done something real, and that people had seen it and wanted to be part of something real themselves. Vera Hutchins started a community garden on the vacant lot next to the post office. She approached 3 of the elderly women on her mail route who had been experienced gardeners before age and circumstance had made it difficult, and she organized a rotating work schedule. By July, the garden was producing tomatoes, squash, green beans, and peppers. It was also producing something else, a reason for people to be outside in the same space talking. Gerald Pratt converted one of his gas station's unused bays into a small lending library, mostly donated books. He told me it had been his wife's idea, and he'd been sitting on it for 2 years, and somehow Elias' speech had made him feel like it was finally the right time. He couldn't have told you why. I could have told him, I think, but I didn't. Tomas Vargas started doing pro bono plumbing repairs for elderly residents who'd been managing without them, leaky faucets, failing water heaters, pipes that hadn't been quite right for years. He'd been thinking about it for a long time, he said. He had the skills. He had some time. Why hadn't he been doing it? He didn't have a good answer. I noticed that none of these things were announced at town meetings. They were just done. Quietly and practically, the way Elias had bought his chickens and started his enclosures. Not with a speech about what it would mean, but with the action itself, trusting that the meaning would be visible. I wrote in my log, I think I'm watching something propagate. Not hope exactly, hope is too fragile and too abstract for what this is. Something more like agency, the recognition that action is possible even when circumstances are bad. The hearing was scheduled for the last week of August. Greta had put together a substantial documentation package. It included the in-kind contributions portfolio, Elias eggs, the community garden's produce valuation, the library, Tomas's pro bono work, a half-dozen other contributions, plus enrollment projections that accounted for 2 new families who had moved into town in June. One of them, a young couple with 3 children who had come from Austin looking for cheap land and a slower pace, had cited the community's visible investment in its own future as a reason for choosing Grady Creek specifically. They'd read about it somewhere, a local news item that had picked up a little traction online, about the chicken farm and the school. That was the first time I realized the story might be bigger than Grady Creek. It made me uncomfortable. These were people I knew, and the dynamics of outside attention on a fragile community are not always straightforward. I mentioned it to Elias. "You're worried people will turn it into something it's not," he said. "I'm worried it'll get simplified, made into a feel-good thing that papers over the real difficulty." He nodded slowly. "That's going to happen regardless of whether we worry about it. The question is whether the actual thing is solid enough to survive being misrepresented." I thought about that. Is it? He looked at the enclosures for a moment. "The eggs are real," he said. "The kids are eating them, that's real. The rest is," he made a small, dismissive gesture. "The rest is what people decide to say about it." He got sick in early August. Not dramatically sick, not the kind of sick that requires hospitalization or generates an obvious crisis. Just the accumulated cost of 6 months of sustained physical effort, inadequate sleep, and caloric restriction making itself felt. He had a chest infection that he tried to manage on his own for 2 weeks before Vera Hutchins, who had appointed herself his informal monitor in the way that post-office workers sometimes appoint themselves the informal monitors of the people on their routes, called me and said, "Cole, Elias Cutter is coughing, and he hasn't been into town in 3 weeks, and I think someone should check on him." I went the next morning. He was on the porch when I pulled up, which was a good sign. He was vertical. But he looked diminished in a way I hadn't seen before. The efficiency of him was still there, but it was running on reserves. He had a blanket over his shoulders despite the August heat, which told me he was running a fever. "I'm fine," he said immediately. "You have a blanket on in August," I said. "You're not fine." "The hens are fine, that's what matters." I sat in the other porch chair. We sat in silence for a while, which with Elias was always a functional kind of silence rather than an awkward one. "When did you last eat a real meal?" I asked. He thought about it, which meant it had been a while. "Elias, feed costs have been higher than I projected," he said. It wasn't defensive. It was just factual the way he was about everything. "I've been making adjustments. To your own nutrition. To everything." I looked at him. I thought about Dina again, the dietitian who had talked about children's development and inadequate protein, and whose husband was now running a fever and skipping meals to keep chickens fed. There was something in that circularity that I couldn't decide was tragic or darkly appropriate or both. "You know what Dina would say about this?" I said. "I know," he said. He said it quietly. Not irritated, not dismissive, just acknowledging it. "What would she say?" He was quiet for a moment. The hens made their sounds in the background, the normal, comfortable sounds of birds who have rediscovered what it means to be healthy chickens. "She'd say that you can't feed other people's children if you're not feeding yourself. She had a phrase for it. You can't pour from an empty vessel." He paused. "She said it to me once when she was sick, and I was trying to do everything and not eating right, not sleeping right. She said it, and then she made me sit down and eat something." I didn't say anything, neither did he for a while. "I'm going to go get food from Vera's garden," I said finally. "And I'm going to come back here and make something, and you're going to eat it. And tomorrow I'm going to take you to the clinic in Marfield and get that chest looked at." He started to object. I looked at him. "You can't pour from an empty vessel," I said. He closed his eyes, opened them. "All right," he said. The clinic visit confirmed a bacterial chest infection, Not serious, but requiring antibiotics and rest, actual rest. The kind that a man running a one-person operation of 300 birds has difficulty arranging. The doctor in Marfield was direct about it. 2 weeks of reduced activity, no strenuous lifting, adequate sleep and nutrition, or the infection would deepen. 2 weeks, the hearing was in 3 weeks. I didn't wait for him to ask. I called Gerald and I called Tomas, and I called 2 of the men from the May meeting who told me privately they'd been wanting to help, but hadn't known how. I organized a morning and evening rotation. Someone would come to Elia's farm twice a day to handle feeding, watering, and basic flock checks. The list filled up in under 2 hours. When I told him, he sat with the information for a moment. Then he said, "You knew I wouldn't ask. I knew you'd need to be worked around." He stopped. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. I'm tired of watching you try to do everything yourself." "It's my project." "Elia's," I said. "It stopped being just your project sometime in May, you know that." He looked out at the enclosures. 281 hens doing their daily business in the morning light, foraging, dust bathing, conducting the low-stakes social negotiations of a settled flock. They looked nothing like the stressed, feather-worn birds I'd seen at Harmon's yard in March. They looked like what they were, healthy animals living in something approaching their natural state, producing real food for people who needed it. He didn't say anything, but I noticed that he stopped arguing. The state hearing was held on August 28th in the county seat at Marfield, in a conference room on the 4th floor of the county administration building. It smelled like old carpet and institutional coffee, and the particular bureaucratic neutrality of rooms where people's fates get decided by people who don't live with the consequences. Greta Sanchez presented the district's case for 2 hours. I was there. Elias was there on antibiotics, improved but not fully recovered, in the same canvas work shirt and the same boots, his dark blue notebook open on his knee. About 30 other Grady Creek residents had driven the 35 miles to be present, which meant 30 cars on a county road on a Thursday morning, which was its own kind of statement. I'm not going to pretend the hearing was dramatic in the way public hearings sometimes are in stories. It wasn't. The State Review Board was 3 administrators in their 50s who had done this before, and who were, I think, genuinely trying to make a fair decision within the constraints of a system that had limited resources and a lot of failing small districts to manage. They asked careful questions. They reviewed the documentation package Greta had prepared. They noted the in-kind contributions portfolio. One of them, a woman named Dr. Carla Baines, who ran the state's Rural Education Division, asked specifically about the egg supply agreement. Greta explained it. The farm, the rehabilitation, the formalized partnership, the documented valuation. "And this is one individual?" Dr. Baines asked. "Operating this farm independently?" "Yes," Greta said. "Elias Cutter, he's here if you have questions for him." Elias looked up. Dr. Baines looked at him. There was a brief, quiet assessment. "Mr. Cutter," she said, "what made you decide to do this?" He didn't pause. It wasn't a question he needed to think about. "My wife was a dietitian," he said. "She cared a lot about children getting real food. After she passed, I had some time and some land and a particular set of skills." It seemed like the obvious thing. "The obvious thing," Dr. Baines repeated, not mockingly, more like she was noting it. "Yes, ma'am." The board deliberated for an hour and 40 minutes. We waited in the hallway. Elias drank water and didn't speak much. Gerald Pratt told a story about a truck he'd tried to fix in 1987 that I'm fairly certain was embellished, but that made several people laugh, which was what Gerald had intended. I sat against the wall and wrote in my log and tried to read Elias' face when he wasn't looking at me, which was what I'd been doing all spring and summer. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had done a large amount of work over a sustained period and was now waiting to see whether it had counted. There was no particular anxiety in his expression. Or rather, the anxiety was present but contained, managed, held at a functional distance by the same quality that had allowed him to bury 19 chickens and keep going and haul water in 104-degree heat, and cut back on his own food and still show up at 6 every morning to tend the flock. I thought about Dina. I thought about the way he'd said it seemed like the obvious thing, and I knew it had been the opposite of obvious. that it had required a particular kind of mental and emotional architecture to arrive at I will spend my last $15 on broken chickens as a response to my wife's death and my town's collapse, and have that be, somehow, the logical conclusion. The door opened. Dr. Baines came out alone. "We're going to recommend a conditional continuation," she said. "2 years with quarterly progress reviews. The district will need to demonstrate continued enrollment stability and sustained community support partnerships." She paused. "I want to be clear that this is not a permanent resolution. The structural challenges haven't disappeared, but the evidence of community investment it's genuine. That matters to us." Greta nodded. She was composed because she was always composed, but I could see what the news was doing to her. Gerald let out a long breath. Tomas put his hand on Elia's shoulder briefly, a gesture that Elias didn't shrug off, which for Elias was the equivalent of an embrace. I wrote in my log that evening, conditional continuation, 2 years. The structural challenges haven't disappeared. I keep thinking about that phrase the way Dr. Baines said it with neither cruelty nor softness. Just accuracy. She was right. The eggs are real and the garden is real and the library is real, but the underlying math hasn't changed. They've bought time. The question is what they do with it. The drive back to Grady Creek was 35 miles on a country road in late afternoon light, and I drove it behind Elias' rusted Ford, which I'd been doing more and more that summer, following that truck at a respectful distance, watching it negotiate curves and dips, noting the way it moved through the landscape it had always moved through. He pulled over at a turnout about halfway back, and I pulled in behind him. He got out and stood at the edge of the road, looking at the country. I got out too and stood beside him. We didn't say anything for a while. The light was doing what light does in Texas in late August, turning everything amber and copper, making the scrubby cedars look better than they are, making the dry grass glow. 2 years, he said. 2 years? That's not very long. No, I said, but it's something. He was quiet. Then, Dina would have been good at this, the organizing part, talking to people, getting them to work together. She was easy with people in a way I'm not. A pause. I keep wondering if she'd have gotten it done faster, better. Maybe, I said, but she's not here, you are. He looked at the country for another moment. Yes, he said. I am. That was all. We got back in our trucks and drove the rest of the way to Grady Creek. The fall was different from the spring. Not transformed. I want to be careful about that word because transformation implies a completeness that wasn't real and wasn't honest. The structural challenges Dr. Baines had mentioned hadn't disappeared. The plant wasn't coming back. The 31 miles to the grocery store was still 31 miles. The tax base was still thin. The road was still bad. But there was something different in the texture of daily life in Grady Creek that fall, something I noticed in the log entries from September and October and found difficult to name precisely. The best I could do was this: people were doing things, not grand things. Small, practical things, the kind of things that don't make news but that constitute, in aggregate, the actual fabric of a functional community. The garden ran into autumn and produced a final harvest of winter squash. Vera organized a canning session in the school's home ec kitchen, which had been unused for years, and the resulting jars went to 12 elderly residents who lived alone. Gerald's lending library had grown, by informal donation, to nearly 800 volumes. He'd rigged a system where people could take books and return them or not, on the honor principle, and the default was apparently to return them because the shelves were never empty. 2 of the families who'd been on the edge of leaving, I'd heard about this from Vera, who heard about everything, decided to stay for at least another year. One of them cited the school's continuation. The other cited, specifically, the eggs. They had a child with a dietary restriction, and the quality of the eggs from Elias' flock had made a real difference. I thought about Dina Cutter when I heard that. I thought she would have been glad to know it. Elias recovered fully from the chest infection by late September. I know because by early October he was back to hauling his own feed and doing his own morning rounds and generally declining assistance with the focused stubbornness that was his natural state. The antibiotics had worked. The rest had worked, or enough of it had. He'd also made a decision that I learned about from Vera before he told me himself. He was taking on an apprentice, or rather, a student. The word apprentice implies a formal arrangement, and this was more informal than that. A 17-year-old named Marco Espinoza, the son of a family that had been in Grady Creek for 3 generations, who had been talking to his mother about leaving after graduation to find work in San Antonio. Elias had approached him, which was remarkable, given Elias' general approach to human interaction, and offered him a part-time paid position learning the operation. "Why him?" I asked when Elias told me. "He's practical," Elias said, "and he's interested if you give him something real to be interested in," and he paused. "He reminds me of how I was at that age, before I had the farm to anchor me." I didn't ask what would have happened to Elias without the farm to anchor him, but I thought about it. Marco came 3 mornings a week through the fall and winter, and I saw them together sometimes, the lean, weathered man and the 17-year-old learning to move through a flock of chickens without agitating them, learning the difference between a bird that was behaving normally and one that was signaling illness, learning the particular math of a sustainable small farm. Elias taught the way he did everything, without excess. He showed, explained once, and then watched while Marco tried. He corrected without criticism. He was patient in the specific way of someone for whom patience is a deliberate practice, rather than a natural state. I wrote in my log, "Watching him teach is watching him choose." He's choosing to transfer what he knows. That's a different kind of choice than the ones he made in March. In November, the first online piece came out. A writer for a regional outlet had tracked down the story of Grady Creek through the state hearing records and written a piece that was, as I'd feared, somewhat simplified. It leaned on the chickens as a symbol and underplayed the collective nature of what had happened, and it made Elias sound more heroic and singular than was accurate or fair. He read it at my kitchen table. I watched his face while he read it. "It's not quite right," he said. "No, I don't love the way it's," he searched for the word. "The way it centers on me. Gerald did things, Tomas did things, Vera, everyone who showed up to haul water when the pump went out." He set the tablet down. "It makes it sound like one person did a thing and everyone else just benefited." "That's how these stories usually get told," I said. "One person, clear narrative symbol." "It's not accurate." "No, but is the core of it true? The eggs, the school, the partnership." "Yes." "Then maybe that's what you hold on to." He was quiet. Then, Dina would have wanted the credit distributed more evenly. "Probably write a letter to the editor." He looked at me as though this was a genuinely novel idea. "Can I do that?" "You absolutely can." He did. He wrote it longhand in his dark blue notebook first, then typed it up on the old desktop computer in his living room that I suspect hadn't been used since before Dina died. It was about 350 words, precise and unembellished, acknowledging by name every person who had contributed to the project in a meaningful way. It ended with a single sentence. "My wife believed that a community is measured by what it does for its most vulnerable members, and the people of Grady Creek have been proving her right." The regional outlet published it as a follow-up. It got more attention than the original piece. Winter came, the flock settled into its cold weather routine. Egg production dropped slightly, as it does. Shorter days mean less light-stimulated laying, but not catastrophically. Elias had prepared for this and had built a small supplemental light system in the main enclosure, just enough to extend the effective day by an hour on each end. Not enough to stress the birds, but enough to maintain functional production through the school's winter months. I came out on a January morning. It was cold, genuinely cold. One of those rare Texas winter days where the temperature doesn't break 40, and found him standing in the enclosure in his heavy canvas coat, just watching the flock. Not doing anything, not working, just watching. I stood at the fence for a while without saying anything. The hens moved the way healthy hens move in cold weather, a bit more sedately, clustered near the warmer areas, making their low conversational sounds. The light was flat and gray, and the cedars were dark against it. Somewhere on the property, a mockingbird was running through its repertoire in the unself-conscious way of mockingbirds. "How are they?" I asked. "Good," he said. "They're good." A pause. I was thinking about March. "What about March?" I drove to Dale Harmon's yard with $15, and I genuinely didn't know if it was going to work. I had the idea, I had the plan, but I had no certainty. He paused. "I don't know if I would have done it if I'd known how hard it was going to be. The heat, the pump, the infection, all of it." I thought about what to say to that. But you would have, I said finally. He looked at me. Because you knew that not doing it was worse, I said. You know that about yourself. He turned back to the flock. One of the hens, a large, confident barred rock who had been among the first to fully rehabilitate and who had established herself as a dominant bird in the flock hierarchy, walked deliberately over to Elias and stood near his feet. He looked down at her. She looked up at him with the focused, lateral gaze of a chicken assessing a situation. He crouched down and she didn't move away. He held out his hand, palm down, and she butted her head against it once with the offhand familiarity of an animal that has decided a human is acceptable company. I noticed that he smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the kind of smile that happens on the face of someone who has been careful with their hope for a long time and has allowed a small amount of it out. The kind that, if you're not watching closely, you miss entirely. I was watching closely. I wrote it in the log. The school's spring term started in January. The egg delivery had been formalized, 42 dozen per week, arriving Tuesday and Friday mornings in crates that Elias and Marco loaded into the Ford and drove the 4 miles into town. The school's lunch coordinator, a woman named Patricia Ose, who had been making do with commodity boxes for 2 years, had developed a rotation of recipes that used the fresh eggs as a centerpiece. Egg and vegetable frittatas, egg salad on homemade bread, scrambled eggs with produce from Vera's garden surplus. I stopped by the school once in February when the lunch run coincided with a day I had business in town. I sat in the cafeteria for about 20 minutes. I watched 109 children eat lunch. They were loud, they were chaotic. They were doing what children do at lunch tables, negotiating the complex social landscape of childhood with varying degrees of success. Talking too loud, trading food items, occasionally throwing things, occasionally being kind to each other in the unpremeditated way of children who haven't yet learned to perform kindness. They were eating real food. I thought about Dina Cutter. I thought about a woman I'd never met, who had spent her professional life thinking about what children ate and what it meant for their development, and who had apparently talked about it enough, and with enough conviction that her husband had carried the weight of that concern through her illness and her death and 4 years of grief, and come out the other side of it with $15 and a plan. I didn't write much in the log that day. Some things resist the impulse toward notation. Some things just need to be sat with. In March, exactly 1 year after Elias had pulled his rusted Ford into Dale Harmon's yard, I drove out to his property on a Sunday morning. It was a good March day, one of those early spring mornings in Texas that make you remember why you live there, when the air is clean and the light is sharp and the country looks like it means well. He was in the enclosure doing his morning rounds. Marco was with him, notebook out, writing something down. Elias was talking quietly, and Marco was listening with the specific, focused attention of a young person who has found something worth paying attention to, which is a particular kind of attention, and not always easy to come by. I leaned on the fence post and watched them. 279 hens. That was the current count, attrition, and the natural losses of a living flock, offset by 8 new hens that a family outside of town had donated when they heard about the project. The birds moved with the settled, purposeful energy of a healthy flock that had found its equilibrium. They looked nothing like the stressed, feather-worn creatures I'd seen at Dale Harmon's yard a year ago. Elias saw me and raised a hand, the wave of a man who is busy but not closed. I raised one back. I thought about what I would write in the log later. I'd been thinking about it on the drive over, the way I sometimes think about what to write when I sense that something is coming to a kind of punctuation mark. Not an ending, because what was happening in Grady Creek wasn't ending, but a pause, a moment where you can step back and assess what you're looking at. The conditional continuation would be reviewed in August. 2 years, they were halfway through it. The enrollment had stayed stable, actually gained 3 students from the families who'd moved in. The garden was planning its 2nd season. Marco was talking, according to his mother, about staying in Grady Creek after graduation rather than going to San Antonio. This was not a settled thing. It was a possibility. Possibilities were not nothing. The state's structural realities had not changed. The economics of rural Texas had not changed. The 31 miles to the grocery store were still 31 miles. There were things that Elias' chickens could not fix, and Elias knew this better than anyone, and he had never claimed otherwise. But here was what I thought about, leaning on that fence post in the March morning. He had walked into Dale Harmon's yard with $15 and a conviction that came from grief and love and a particular kind of stubbornness that is different from ordinary stubbornness. The kind that points itself at something outside itself, at people other than the self, and says this is the thing I will spend myself on. He had been right, not in a grand, vindicating way. Not in the way that stories like to be right, with clear resolution and earned triumph, but in the smaller, more durable way. Right that something could be done, right that doing it would matter, right that other people would join him if he gave them something real to join. Dina had known something about empty vessels, about the inability to pour from them. What Elias had done, what I'd watched him do across 12 months of heat and loss and chest infections and water hauling and bureaucratic hearings and quiet winter mornings, was fill something up. Fill himself up partly. Fill the space where his grief had been living alone, fill it with purpose and labor, and the specific non-abstract satisfaction of watching living things recover.